The Sangreal. When Sir Lancelot came to the palace of King Pelles, in the words of Sir Thomas Malory 2:16, neither of them made much of other, and so they went into the castle for to take their repast. And anon there came in a dove at the window, and in her bill there seemed a little censer of gold, and therewith there was such a savour as though all the spicery of the world had been there. And forthwith all there was upon the table all manner of meats and drinks fiat they could think upon. So there came a damosel, passing fair and young, and she bare a vessel of gold between her hands, and thereto the king kneeled devoutly and said his prayers, and so did all that were there. "O, Jesu," said Sir Lancelot, "what may this mean?" "This is," said King Pelles, "the richest thing that any man hath living, and when this thing goeth about, the round table shall be broken." "And wit ye well," said King Pelles, "that this is the holy Sangreal which ye have here seen." The next to see the sacred vessel was the pious Sir Bors. And after that he had seen it, he was led to bed into a fair large chamber, and many doors were shut about that chamber. And when Sir Bors espied all those doors, he made all the people to avoid, for he might have no body with him, but in no wise Sir Bors would unarm him, but so laid him upon the bed. And right so he saw come in a light that he might see a spear great and long which come straight upon him point long. And so Sir Bors seemed that the head of the spear brent like a taper. And anon, or Sir Bors wist, the spear head smote him into the shoulder and hand breadth in deepness, and that wound grieved Sir Bors passing sore. One day, when King Arthur and his court were at Camelot, sitting at supper, anon they heard cracking and crying of thunder, that hem thought the place should all to rive. In the midst of the blast entred a sunbeam more clear by 7 times than ever they saw day, and all they were alighted by the grace of the Holy Ghost. Then began every knight to behold other, and either saw other by their seeming fairer than ever they saw afore, nor for then there was no knight that might speak any word a great while, and so they looked every man on other as they had been dumb. Then there entred into the hall the Holy Grail covered with white samite, but there was none that might see it, nor who bare it, and there was all the hall fulfilled with good odours. And every knight had such meat and drink as he best loved in this world. And when the Holy Grail had been borne through the hall, then the holy vessel departed suddenly, and they wist not where it became. Then the knights stood up in their places one after another, and vowed to go in quest of the Sangreal, and not to return to the Round Table till they had obtained a full view of it. We must leave the knights to start upon their quest, and turn, for the history of the Grail, to the romance of the Sangreal, the Perceval of Crétin de Troyes, written at the close of the 12th century. And the Titurel and Parzival of Wolfram von Eschenbach, translated into German from romances older than that of Crétin de Troyes. When Christ was transfixed by the spear, there flowed from his side blood and water. Joseph of Arimathea collected the blood in the vessel from which the Saviour had eaten the Last Supper. The enraged Jews cast Joseph into prison, and left him to die of hunger. But for 42 years he lay in the dungeon nourished and invigorated by the sacred vessel which was in his possession. Titus released Joseph from prison, and received baptism at his hands. Then Joseph started with the vessel and the blood, or the Sangreal, for Britain. Before he died, he confided the sacred treasure to his nephew. But according to another version of the legend, the Grail was preserved in heaven, till there should appear on earth a race of heroes, worthy to become its guardians. The chief of this line was an Asiatic prince, named Perillus, who came to Gaul, where his descendants allied themselves with the family of a Breton prince. Titurel, who sprang from this heroic lineage, was the one chosen of God to found the worship of the Sangreal among the Gauls. Angels brought the vessel to him, and instructed him in its mysteries. He erected, on the model of the temple at Jerusalem, a magnificent temple to the Grail. He organized a band of guardians of the vessel, and elaborated the ceremonial of its worship. The Grail, we are told, was only visible to the baptized, and only partially if they were tainted by sin. To the pure in heart alone was it perfectly visible. Every Good Friday a white dove descended from heaven, bearing a white oblation which it laid before the Grail. The holy vessel gave oracles, expressed miraculously in characters which appeared on the surface of the bowl, and then vanished. Spiritual blessings attended on the vision and custody of the sacred vessel. The guardians, and those who were privileged to behold it, were conscious of a mysterious internal joy, a foretaste of that of heaven. The material blessings are easier to be described. The Grail stood in the place of all food, it supplied its worshippers with the meats they most desired and the drinks most to their taste, it maintained them in perpetual youth. The day on which the Grail had been seen, its guardians were incapable of being wounded or suffering any hurt. If they fought for 8 days after the vision, they were susceptible of wounds but not of death. Everything in the construction of the temple was full of mystery. It was erected on Mont Salvage, of precious stones, gold, and aloe wood. In form it was circular, there were 3 principal entrances. The knights who watched the Grail were patterns of virtue. All sensual love, even within the limits of marriage, was strictly forbidden. A single thought of passion would obscure the eye and conceal the mystic vessel. The chief of this order of knights was entitled king. As his office was hereditary, he was permitted to marry. When the faith or the right was in jeopardy, a bell rang in the chapel of the Grail, and a knight was bound to go forth sword in hand to the defense. Wherever he was, should a question be asked him of his condition or office in the temple, he was to refuse to answer, and at once to return to Mont Salvage. Titurel reigned 400 years, and he, to all appearances, seemed of the age of 40. He was succeeded in his office by his son Firmutel, who transgressed, by loving a damsel, Florimé by name. Consequently he lost the grace of the Holy Grail, and fell in a joust, engaged in to give pleasure and due honor to his mistress. He was succeeded by his son Amfortas, who fell into grievous sin, and was given over by the Grail to be wounded by a lance. Then it was announced that he should not be healed of his wound till one came, pure and young, to Mont Salvage who would see the mysteries of the sacred vessel, and ask their signification. This Amfortas is the Pels or Pelham of the Morte d'Arthur. Years passed, and the king lay wounded in his palace. The Brotherhood of the Grail was dissolved, and the existence of the temple and its mystic rites was almost forgotten. Sir Thomas Malory gives a different account of the wounding of the king from that in the Romans du Sangreal, and makes his healing depend on the arrival of a knight who is a clean maid, who shall apply to him the sacred blood. In the fullness of time, Galahad, the good knight, came to King Arthur's court, and went forth, with the other knights, to the quest of the Holy Grail. Let us follow Lancelot who was on a ship. The wind arose and drove Sir Lancelot more than a moneth throughout the sea, where he slept but little and prayed unto God that he might have a sight of the Sangreal. So it befell upon a night at midnight he arrived afore a castle on the back side, which was rich and fair, and there was a postern that opened toward the sea, and was open without any keeping, save 2 lions kept the entry. And the moon shined clear. Anon Sir Lancelot heard a voice that said, Lancelot, go out of this ship, and enter into the castle where thou shalt see a great part of thy desire. Then he ran to his arms, and armed him, and so he went unto the gate, and saw the 2 lions, then he set hands to his sword and drew it. Then came there suddenly a dwarf, that smote him upon the arm so soon that the sword fell out of his hand. Then he heard a voice that said, O man of evil faith and poor belief, wherefore believest thou more in thy harness than in thy Maker? For he might more avail thee than thine armor, in whose service thou art set. Ni Sir Lancelot entered in so armed, and he found no gate nor door but it was opened. And so at the last he found a chamber whereof the door was shut, and he set his hands thereto for to have opened it, but he might not. Then he enforced him much for to undo the door. Then he listened, and heard a voice which sung so sweetly that it seemed none earthly thing, and him thought that the voice said, Joy and honor be to the Father of heaven. Then Sir Lancelot kneeled down before the chamber, for well he wist that there was the Sangreal in that chamber. Then said he, Fair sweet Father, Jesu Christ, if ever I did thing that pleased the Lord, for thy pity have me not in despite for my foul sins done here before time, and that thou shew me something of that which I seek. And with that he saw the chamber door open, and there came out a great clearness, that the house was as bright as though all the torches of the world had been there. So came he to the chamber door, and would have entered, and anon a voice said unto him, Flee, Sir Lancelot, and enter not, for thou oughtest not to do it, and if thou enter thou shalt forthink it. And he withdrew him back, and was right heavy in his mind. Then looked he up in the midst of the chamber, and saw a table of silver, and the holy vessel covered with red samite, and many angels about it, whereof one of them held a candle of wax burning, and the other held a cross. And the ornaments of the altar. And before the holy vessel he saw a good man clothed like a priest, and it seemed that he was at the sacring of the mass. And it seemed unto Sir Lancelot that above the priest's hands there were 3 men, whereof the 2 put the youngest by likeness betweeneth priest's hands, and so he lifted up on high, and it seemed to shew so to the people. And then Sir Lancelot marvailed not a little, for him thought that the priest was so greatly charged of the figure, that him seemed that he should have fallen to the ground. And when he saw none about him that would help him, then he came to the door a great pace, and entreed into the chamber, and came toward the table of silver. And when he came nigh he felt a breath, that him thought was intermeddled with fire, which smote him so sore in the visage that him thought it all to brent his visage, and therewith he fell to the ground, and had no power to arise. Sir Galahad, Sir Percival, and Sir Bors met in the forest, and rode together to the castle of King Pelles. There they supped, and after supper they beheld a great light, and in the light were 4 angels bearing up an ancient man in bishop's vestments, and they set him down before a table of silver, on which appeared the Sangreal. And this aged prelate was Joseph of Arimathea, the first bishop of Christendom. Then other angels appeared bearing scandies, and a spear from which fell drops of blood, and these drops were collected by an angel in a box. Then the angels set the candles upon the table, and the 4th set the holy spear even upright upon the vessel, as represented on an ancient churchyard crucifix, in rude sculpture, at Sangreal, in Cornwall. Joseph next celebrated the sacred mysteries, and, at the consecration, our blessed Lord appeared and said, Galahad, son, wottest thou what I hold between my hands? Nay, replied the maiden knight, but if ye tell me. This is, he said, the holy dish wherein I eat the lamb on Sure Thursday, and now hast thou seen that thou desirest most to see, but yet hast thou not seen it so openly as thou shalt see it in the city of Sarras, in the spiritual place. Therefore thou must go hence, and bear with thee this holy vessel, for this night it shall depart from the realm of Logris, that it shall never be seen more here. So Galahad, after having anointed the wounded king with the blood which dropped from the spear, and made him whole, departed with his friends Bors and Perceval to the mystic city of Sarras, where he was made king. The story is somewhat different in the Perceval of Crétin de Troyes. This romance was commenced by Crétin at the request of Philip of Alsace, Count of Flanders. It was continued by Gautier de Denat and finished by Manassir, towards the close of the 12th century. It is the history of the quest of the Sangreal. Perceval was the son of a poor widow in Wales, brought up by her in a forest, far removed from all warlike images. One day he saw a knight ride past, and from that moment he had no rest, till his mother gave him arms and let him ride to the court of King Arthur. On his way he saw a tent in which lay a beautiful damsel asleep. Perceval took the ring from her finger, ate and drank at the table which was spread in the tent, and then pursued his course. As he entered the court at Cardwale, a felon knight stole the goblet from the king's table. Perceval went in pursuit. One evening he entered a castle where lay a sick king on a couch. The door of the hall opened, and there came in a servant bearing a bleeding lance, others with golden candlesticks, and finally the Holy Grail. Perceval asked no questions, and was reproached on his leaving the castle for not making inquiries into the mystery of the Grail. Afterwards he undertook the quest of this marvelous vessel, but had great difficulty in finding again the castle of the wounded king. When his search was crowned with success, he asked the signification of the mystic rite which took place before his eyes, and was told that the king was a fisher, descended from Joseph of Arimathea, and uncle of Perceval. That the spear was that which had pierced the Saviour's side, and that the Grail was the vessel in which the sacred blood of Christ had been collected. The king had been wounded in trying to mend a sword which had been broken by a knight named Pertinax, and which could only be welded together by a knight without fear and reproach. The Fisher King would recover health only when Pertinax died. On hearing this, Perceval sought out and slew Pertinax, healed his uncle, obtained in return the sacred vessel and the bleeding lance, and retired to a hermitage. On his death, Fato seal remis sans doubtance. Et le Sangreal et la lance. It is very certain that Chrétien de Troyes was not the inventor of this mystic tale, for there exists in the Red Book a Welsh tale entitled Fyreder, which is indisputably the original of Perceval. The Red Book is a volume of Welsh prose and verse romances and tales, begun in the year 1318, and finished in 1454. It is preserved in the library of Jesus College, Oxford. Although Fyreder was transcribed after Perceval was composed, it bears evidence of a higher antiquity. Fyreder is not a Christian. His habits are barbarous. The Grail is not a sacred Christian vessel, but a mysterious relic of a past heathen rite. The same incidents occur in Perceval as in Fyreder, but in the former they are modified and softened, and various points indicative of barbarism and paganism are omitted. Fyreder enters a castle, and, whilst he and his uncle were discoursing together, they beheld two young men entering the hall, bearing a lance of unusual length, from the point of which distilled 3 gouts of gore. And when the company beheld this, they began to wail and lament. But the old man continued to talk with Fyreder, and as he did not tell Fyreder the reason of what took place, Fyreder did not venture to ask him. And when the cries ceased, there entered 2 damsels with a basin in which was the head of a man swimming in blood. Then the company uttered a piercing wail. In the Perceval, and in the Morte d'Arthur, the head is omitted, and to the lance and grail are attributed a Christian value, but in the Fyreder there is no trace whatever of these symbols having any Christian signification. Fyreder signifies, according to M. de la Ville, Mark 2:17, the companion of the basin, and is a synonym of Perceval, per being a basin, and cavol and keter having alike the meaning of companion. Fyreder is mentioned as well in the Annals Cambrii, which extend from the year 444 to 1066. Geoffrey of Monmouth also speaks of the reign of Peredur, who governed the people with generosity and mildness, so that he even excelled his other brothers who had preceded him 218. And the anonymous author of the Life of Merlin speaks of him as the companion and consoler of the bard 219. Aneurin, the contemporary of Hengst and Horsa, the author of the Gododin, terms him one of the most illustrious princes of the Isle of Britain 220. Taliesin ben Beard, the famous poet of the same age, speaks of the sacred vessel in a manner which connects it with bardic mythology. This vessel, he says, inspires poetic genius, gives wisdom, discovers the knowledge of futurity, the mysteries of the world, the whole treasure of human sciences. And he describes it as adorned like the Grail, with a beading of pearls and diamonds. One of his poems contains the history of Bran the Blessed, in which the mystic vessel occupies a prominent position. One day, whilst hunting in Ireland, Bran arrived on the banks of a lake, called the Lake of the Basin. He saw there a black and hideous giant, a witch, and a dwarf, rise from the water holding a vessel in their hands. He persuaded them to accompany him to Wales, where he lodged them in his palace, and in return for his hospitality, received the basin. This vase had the property of healing all mortal ills, of staunching blood, of resuscitating the dead. But those who were restored to life by it were not enabled to speak, lest they should divulge the mysteries of the vessel. At a banquet given by Bran to Marthelone, King of Ireland, the Welsh prince presented the bowl to his guest. He regretted that he had made this present, when some years later war broke out between the King of Ireland and himself. Then he found himself unable to cope with his adversary, whose every slain soldier recovered life by means of the sacred vessel. But Bran smote off the head of a hostile chief, and cast the bloody head into the bowl, when it burst, and its virtues ceased. This basin was reckoned as one of the 13 wonders of the Isle of Britain, brought by Merdhin, or Merlin, in his crystal ark. That it is the same as Ceridwen's cauldron is not improbable. Ceridwen was the Celtic Great Mother, the Demeter, the source of life, and the receptacle of the dead. The story of her cauldron is told in the Père Ceridwen, Vessel of Ceridwen, or Haynes Taliesin, History of Taliesin. In ancient times there was a man, Tegid by name, who had a wife called Ceridwen, by whom he had a son Morven ap Tegid, and a daughter Creirwe, both very beautiful, also a Ragdu, the most hideous of beings. Ceridwen, knowing that the poor deformed child would have little joy of life, determined to prepare for him the water of inspiration. She placed a cauldron on a fire, filled it with the requisite ingredients, and left little Gwayan to attend to its seething, and blind Morda to keep up the fire for a year and a day, without suffering the operation to cease for a moment. One day, near the end of the 12th, 3 drops spurt out of the bubbling liquid, and Gwayan caught them on his finger. As they scalded him, he put his finger into his mouth, and at once obtained the knowledge of futurity. He saw that Ceridwen would attempt his death, in consequence of his having tasted the precious drops, so he prudently took to flight. Then the cauldron burst and extinguished the fire. Ceridwen, in her rage, struck Morda on the head, and rushed in pursuit of Gwayan the Little. He transformed himself into a hare, then she took the form of a hound. He sprang into a river and took that of a fish, instantly she became an otter. Then he rose from the water as a little bird, but she soared after him as a hawk. Then he dropped as a grain of wheat on a corn heap, but Ceridwen, instantly taking the shape of a hen, swallowed him. She became pregnant thereby, and in 9 months gave birth to a lovely child which she hid in a leather coracle and committed to the waves, on the 29th of April. In this bardic tale we have certainly a very ancient Celtic myth. What the cauldron signifies it is difficult to ascertain. Some suppose it to represent the ocean, others the working of the vital force of earth, which produces the 3 seasons which are good, symbolized by the drops. But we know too little of Druidic mythology, and those legends which have come to us have descended in a too altered form, for us to place much confidence in such conjectures. But that this vessel of the liquor of wisdom held a prominent place in British mythology is certain from the allusions made to it by the bards. Taliesin, in the description of this initiation into the mysteries of the basin, cries out, "I have lost my speech," because on all who had been admitted to the privileges of full membership secrecy was imposed. This initiation was regarded as a new birth, and those who had once become joined members were regarded as elect, regenerate, separate from the rest of mankind, who lay in darkness and ignorance. That originally the ceremonies of initiation included human sacrifices is more than probable from the vessel being represented as containing human blood, and a lance forming part of the paraphernalia, from which dropped blood. In the story of Faridar, the vessel contained a man's head floating in gore. In that of Bran the Blessed, the head is thrown into the basin to destroy its efficacy. Taliesin also refers to Faridar as the hero of the bleeding head. 221. The lance is also referred to by Welsh authors. One of the predictions attributed to Taliesin holds out to the Britons the hope that the kingdom of Logres, England, shall perish before the bleeding lance, and 5 centuries later. Chrétien de Troyes quotes this saying. Il est écrit tu il est un O tout le royaume de Logres. Que jadis fut la terre es ogres. Sera détruite par cette lance. This lance was probably a symbol of war. The first to adapt the Druidic mystery to Christianity was a British hermit, who wrote a Latin legend on the subject. Helenandus, died in 1227, says, at this time, A.D. 720, in Britain, a marvelous vision was shown by an angel to a certain hermit. It was of the basin or paropsis in which the Saviour supped with his disciples. Concerning which the history was written by the same hermit, which is called the Gradle. And he adds, in French they give the name Gradle, or Graal, to a large, rather deep vessel, in which rich meats with their gravy are served to the wealthy. 222. The date at which lived this anchorite is not certain, for though Helenandus says he had his vision in 720, Usher places him later than 114-0223. After the composition of this legend, the romancers took possession of the myth and adapted it to Christian chivalrous exigencies. The bardic table of the elect became the round table of Arthur's knights, and the sacred vessel of mysteries became the Grail. The head of the victim was forgotten, and the sacrificial blood was supposed to be that of Christ. It is likely that the tradition of the ancient Druidic brotherhood lingered on and gained consistency again among the Templars. Just as the Miles Templi fought for the Holy Sepulchre, so did the soldier of Montsalvich for the Holy Grail. Both orders were vowed to chastity and obedience, both were subject to a head, who exercised regal authority. The ancient Temple of the Grail, like Stonehenge, was circular, so also were the churches dedicated to S. Sepulchre, by the soldier monks. The charge of heresy was brought against the order of the Templars, and it has been supposed that they were imbued with Gnosticism. That this Eastern heresy should have influenced a medieval Western society, I think very unlikely. No other traces of Gnosticism are to be found in the religious history of the Occident, which certainly would have been the case had the heresy been sufficiently powerful to have obtained mastery over an ecclesiastical society. I think the root of the false doctrine or practices of the Templars must be looked for in the West. The Templars were charged with having an idol which the chronicles of S. Denis, which terminate 1461, describe as an old skin embalmed and polished, in which the Templar places his very vile faith and trust. And in which he confidently believes, and it has in the sockets eyes of carbuncle shining with the brightness of the sky. Abraham Zov, in his continuation of the church history of Baronius, quotes a charge brought by the Italian bishops against the Templars, to this effect: they have a certain head, the face pale like that of a man, with black curled hair. And round the neck a gilded ornament, which indeed belonged to no saint, and this they adored, making prayers before it. And one of the questions asked by the Pope of the witnesses was, whether they had not a skull or some sort of image, to which they rendered divine homage. So also the Chronicle of most states, that on the first day of the General Council of the Templars, a head with a white beard, which had belonged to a former Grand Master of the order, was set at midnight before the altar in a chapel, covered with silken robes and precious stuffs. Mass was sung before daylight, and the head was then adored by the Master and the other knights. It seems to me probable that this head, if there were truth in the charge, was revered because it was part of an ancient Druidic rite to produce a head upon a vessel, though for what purposes we do not know. Friar Bacon constructed a head which gave oracles. Possibly some such property was attributed to the Templar, and previously to the Druidic head. Livy tells us that a bloody head of an enemy was a national Celtic symbol, 23:24, and that the boy brought the head into their temples, where they cleansed it and adorned it with gold, and then used it on festivals for a sacred vessel, out of which to make drink offerings. To enter with anything like completeness into the most interesting and intricate subject of Druidic mythology and ceremonial would occupy too much space. This paper will necessarily be imperfect. The religion of our British ancestors has yet to be written. Those who have hitherto approached the subject have so done with preconceived theories which have caused them to read wrong the sacred myths and rites they were interpreting. Much is to be learned from the Arthurian romances, much from Bardic remains, and much from Breton, Welsh, Gaelic, and Irish folklore. That all thus recovered will be in a corrupted form I am well aware, but a practiced eye will be able to restore what is disintegrated, and will know to detect antiquity, though disguised under the newest robe. A careful study of these sources, conducted by the light of comparative mythology, will, I am satisfied, lead to the discovery that, under the name of Methodism, we have the old Druidic religion still alive, energetic, and possibly more vigorous than it was when it exercised a spiritual supremacy over the whole of Britain. With the loss of the British tongue, much of the old terminology has died out, and a series of adaptations to Christianity has taken place, without radically affecting the system. 224. Theophilus. A few years before the Persian invasion in 538, there lived, in the town of Adana in Cilicia, a priest named Theophilus, treasurer and archdeacon. He lived in strict observance of all his religious duties, was famous for his liberality to the poor, his sympathy with the afflicted, his eloquence in the pulpit, his private devotion, and severe asceticism. On the decease of the bishop, by popular acclamation he was summoned to the episcopal oversight of the diocese, but his deep humility urged him to refuse the office, even when it was pressed upon him by the metropolitan. Seldom has a nolo episcopari been carried out to such an emphatic refusal as was given by Theophilus. A stranger was raised to the vacant seat, and the treasurer resumed the course of life he had pursued for so many years with credit to himself and advantage to others, content in his own mind at having refused the office which might have aroused his pride, and which certainly would have diminished his opportunities of self-sacrifice. Virtue invariably arouses the spirit of detraction, and Theophilus, by his refusal of the bishopric, was thrust into public notice, and attracted public attention. The consequence was that the evil-minded and envious originated slanders, which, circulating widely, produced a revulsion of feeling towards Theophilus and, from being generally reported, were accepted as substantially true. These stories reaching the ears of the new bishop, he sent for the archdeacon, and without properly investigating the charges, concluding he was guilty, deprived him of his offices. One would have supposed that the humility which had required the holy man to refuse a mitre, would have rendered him callous to the voice of slander, and have sustained him under deprivation. But the trial was too great for his virtue. He brooded over the accusations raised against him, and the wrongs inflicted upon him, till the whole object of his labor was the clearing of his character. He sought every available means of unmasking the calumnies of his maligners, and exposing the falsity of the charges raised against him. But he found himself unable to effect his object. One man is powerless against a multitude, and slander is a hydra which, when maimed in one head, produces others in the place of that struck off baffled, despairing. And without a friend to sustain his cause, the poor clerk sought redress in a manner which a month ago would have filled him with horror. He visited a necromancer, who led him at midnight to a place where 4 crossroads met, and there conjured up Satan, who promised reinstatement in all his offices to the unfortunate Theophilus, and, what he valued more, a complete clearing of his character. The priest, to obtain these boons, signed away his soul with a pen dipped in his own blood, and abjured for ever Jesus Christ and his spotless mother. On the morrow, the bishop discovering his error, how we know not, sent for Theophilus, and acknowledged publicly that he had been misled by false reports, the utter valuelessness of which he was ready frankly to acknowledge. And he asked pardon of the priest, for having unjustly deprived him of his office. The populace enthusiastically reversed their late opinion of the treasurer, and greeted him as a saint and confessor. For some days all went well, and in the excitement of a return to his former occupations the compact he had made was forgotten. But after a while, as reason and religion resumed their sway, the conscience of Theophilus gave him no rest. He paced his room at nights in an agony of terror, his face lost its color, his brow was seamed with wrinkles, an unutterable horror gleamed from his deep-set eyes. Hour by hour he prayed, but found no relief. At length he resolved on a solemn fast of 40 days. This he accomplished, praying nightly in the church of the Panhagia till the grey of morning stole in at the little windows of the dome and obscured the lamps. On the 40th night, the Blessed Virgin appeared to him, and sadly rebuked him for his sin. He implored her pardon in all-prevailing intercession, and this she promised him. The following night she reappeared and assured him that Christ had, at her prayer, forgiven him. With a cry of joy he awoke. And on his breast lay the deed which had made over his soul to Satan, obtained from the evil one by the mercy of the Sacred Mother of God. The next day was Sunday. He rose, spent some time in acts of thanksgiving, and then went to church where the divine liturgy was being celebrated. After the reading of the Gospel, he flung himself at the bishop's feet, and requested permission to make his confession in public. Then he related the circumstances of his fall, and showed the compact signed with his blood to the assembled multitude. Having finished his confession, he prostrated himself before the bishop and asked for absolution. The deed was torn and burned before the people, he was reconciled and received the blessed sacrament, after which he returned to his house in a fever, and died at the expiration of 3 days. The Church honors him as a penitent, on the February 4th. The original account of this famous compact with the devil is in the Greek of Eutychianus, disciple of Theophilus, who declares that he relates what he had seen with his own eyes, and heard from the mouth of Theophilus himself. From the Greek of Eutychianus, 2 early Latin versions are extant, one by Paulus Diaconus, the other by Gentianus Hervetus. The former of these is published in the great work of the Bollandists, who fixed the date of the event in 538. The version of Gentianus Hervetus purports to be a translation from Simeon Metaphrastes, who flourished in the 10th century, and who embodied the narrative of Eutychianus in his great collection of the lives of the saints. In the 10th century, Hroswitha, the illustrious nun of Gandersheim in Saxony, composed a Latin poem on the story of Theophilus. In the 11th century the legend was versified by Marbodus, Bishop of Rennes. There is a poem on the subject by Gaultier de Coincy. Other rhymed versions have been published by M. Achille Juvenal, and M. Paulin Paris. One of the best of the ancient poems is that of Rutebouf, a Travers of the 13th century. There are several older miracle plays on mysteries of Theophilus, one in French, published by M. Francisque Michel 225, another in Low German, published by M. Docent 226. The latter gentleman has collected a great number of pieces on Theophilus in various European languages, and quotes references to the legend in early French, Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-Norman, and German writers. Archbishop Alfric, d. 1006, alludes to the story in his Homilies S. Bernard also, in his Deparatio ad gloriosam Virginum Mariam Vincent of Beauvais, in his wonderful Speculum Historial S. Bonaventura, as a passionate devotee to the Virgin, could not omit it from his Speculum Vitae Manse. Jacques de Voragine inserts it in his Golden Legend, and Albertus Magnus includes it in his Biblia B. Mariae Virginis. It is again mentioned by the great German poet of the 12th century, Hartmann von der Au, and by Conrad von Würzburg, in the 13th century. A Flemish Theophilus was published by M. Philip Blomert, from an old MS. of the 14th century, in 1836. To the same century belongs one version of the Theophilus legend in Icelandic, published by M. Docent, the other is younger by a century. An old Swedish Theophilus of 1350 exists in the Royal Library at Stockholm. In the Cathedral of Notre Dame, at Paris, are two sculptured representations of the fable, one is on the north porch. In the Cathedral of Leon it is painted on a window in the choir, in 18 medallions. It is also to be seen in the Church of S. Peter, at Troyes, and in that of S. Julian at Mans, in both instances on stained glass. Further information as to the legend, with the texts, can be found in Theophilus, in Icelandic, Low German, and other tongues, from MSS. In the Royal Library, Stockholm, by G. Webby Docent, M.A. Stockholm, 1845, in E. F. Somber, De Theophili cum Diabol Fodera. Halle, 1844. And in Miracle de Théophile, mis en vers au commencement du XHME siècle, par Gautier de Coincy, publié par M. D. Maillet. Rennes, 1838. I do not think it improbable that this famous story may rest on a foundation of truth. Indeed it bears on the face of it tokens of authenticity. Theophilus is driven from his position by slanders, this preys on his mind. By some means he is reinstated. The revulsion of feeling upsets his reason, he undertakes a prodigious fast, goes crazy, tells a long rambling story about a compact with the devil, and dies 3 days after in brain fever. His narrative is the only extraordinary item in the tale. If we remember that this was told after a 40 days fast, and immediately before a mortal fever, the only thing to be wondered at in the legend is that any sane persons believed his ravings to have in them a foundation of truth. The end.